The morning Nora Vane arrived at Ashcroft Park, she did not see the house first. She saw the man. He was on his knees in the kitchen garden, hands dark with soil, a spade laid to one side, and his coat thrown over the garden wall, as though it had never mattered to him. He was perhaps 35, and broad across the shoulders, and the linen of his shirt was plain enough that she might have taken him for anyone. He did not look up when the hired cart rounded the final bend of the gravel path. He was examining something in the earth. A turned clod or a root or some small evidence of drainage gone wrong, with the particular kind of attention that Nora recognized from her father's workshop. He was a man who thought best when his hands were occupied, who had forgotten entirely that the world might be watching him. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pollitt, met the cart at the servants' entrance on the north side. She was a compact woman of 50, with a ring of keys at her hip, and a pleasant, guarded expression that suggested she had managed crises before, and expected to manage more. "Miss Vane," she said, nodding, not unkindly. "You'll share a room with Dorcas the first week, until the second attic chamber is aired. Welcome to Ashcroft." Nora thanked her and climbed down with her single trunk. As they crossed the courtyard toward the entrance, she glanced back at the garden. The man was standing now, retrieving his coat from the wall, and she caught his face in profile. A jaw that would not easily accommodate amusement, a line of brow set with the concentration of someone who had not finished thinking yet. Not unkind, not warm, simply occupied. "Is that Mr. Carey, then?" Nora asked. She had been told the steward's name. Mrs. Pollitt did not follow her glance. "It is," she said. "He manages the estate. You'll have little cause to speak to him directly." She did not mean it as a warning. The hierarchy of a large country house was simply its own geography, and Nora was new enough to be placed by rank at its lower edge. She was 23 and had come to Ashcroft under reduced circumstances. Her father, a clockmaker in Nottingham, had died of a fever in March, and the shop had gone to his creditors, and the house to the landlord. She had taken what she could carry and written 4 letters. One had been answered. So Ashcroft it was, a fine Regency house in Warwickshire, the seat of the Marquess of Ashcroft, who was, by all accounts, not presently in residence. The Marquess had gone to London at Easter, and was expected at the end of the season, and in the meantime, the house turned on the quiet authority of Mrs. Pollitt and the less quiet competence of the steward. Nora did not know quite what she had expected a steward to look like. She had thought, vaguely, of someone older, someone who would present himself as a function of the estate rather than as a person within it. She had not thought of a man on his knees in a kitchen garden with a preoccupied frown and soil on his cuffs. She put him out of her mind and went to learn the house. A country house in full preparation for the return of its master is its own engine, running on 30 small imperatives at once. Nora was assigned principally to the upper floors, under the direction of Dorcas, who had been at Ashcroft for 4 years and communicated primarily through a series of meaningful silences and the occasional exasperated click of the tongue. Nora swept, aired, turned mattresses, polished the long corridor of mirrors on the first floor until her arms ached, and carried coals. She was thorough, and she was quiet about being thorough, which suited Dorcas's temperament better than enthusiasm would have. On her 3rd day, she was asked to carry the household accounts ledger from the study to Mrs. Pollitt's sitting room. She had never been in the study, and she paused in the doorway a moment longer than she should have, because the study at Ashcroft was floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, the spines arranged not alphabetically, but by some private system she could not immediately decipher. And on the writing desk there was a model of a mill sluice gate, built precisely to scale in pale wood, with working joinery and a brass fitting at one hinge. She had seen work like this before. Her father had made similar models when a customer needed to understand a mechanism. She took the ledger and went. She did not touch the model. She thought about it that evening, eating supper in the servants' hall. The model had been on the writing desk, not on a shelf, which meant it was in current use. A steward who studied mill mechanisms, who worked in the kitchen garden on his knees in the dirt. She was not given to romanticizing. She was simply, as her father had taught her, observant. The first time she spoke to Mr. Carey directly, it was an accident. She had been dispatched to the still room for a bottle of elderflower cordial, and she took a wrong turn in the unfamiliar back corridor and found herself instead in a small anteroom off the estate office, where Mr. Carey was standing at a sloped desk reviewing a plan of some kind, a long sheet of paper covered in drawings. He looked up when she entered. "I beg your pardon," she said, already retreating. "Have you got a message?" he asked. His voice was level. It was the voice of someone accustomed to giving and receiving information without ornament. "No. I am looking for the still room. I have taken the wrong passage." He pointed without ceremony at the far door. "Through there, second left." "Thank you," she said. She was 3 steps back through the door when he spoke again. "The cordial cupboard is the second shelf, not the first. The first shelf is liniment." She stopped. She had not told him what she was fetching. She said, without turning fully back, "How did you know it was cordial?" "Mrs. Pollett's sister is visiting. She takes cordial with her afternoon tea." It was such a simple answer that she felt briefly foolish for having asked. She thanked him again and went. Her pulse was somewhat faster than it ought to have been, and she did not examine why. The servants' hall had its own account of Mr. Carey, which Nora assembled over the first 2 weeks the way she might assemble a clock, listening for each piece and fitting them together without rushing. He was thorough to the point of severity. He inspected the tenant farms himself, on foot, every quarter. And he wrote the reports in a hand so small and precise that Mrs. Pollett had once said you needed a candle and patience to read them. He did not drink beyond a single glass in the evenings. He had no known family in the county. He had arrived at Ashcroft 7 years ago as a young man of 28 from somewhere in Derbyshire, recommended by a solicitor whose name no one remembered, and he had made himself indispensable so quietly that the house had simply absorbed him. He was not liked in the familiar sense. He was not disliked either. He was respected, which in a servants' hall is a more complicated thing. A respect that sits at a slight distance, that you would not dream of testing. To Nora's knowledge, he spoke to her directly twice in her first fortnight. Once in the anteroom with the cordial. Once to ask her, as she crossed the corridor near the estate office, whether she had carried up the letters from the post, and when she said she had, he nodded and went back to whatever he had been doing without another word. She was not thinking about him in any particular way. She had no cause to. She was new and poor, and occupied with learning the house. That conviction lasted until the end of her second week, when she found him in the attic. She had gone up to the long attic on an errand from Dorcas, who wanted a particular trunk brought to the landing, and she had been in the attic a full 5 minutes before she discovered she was not alone. He was at the far end, near the window, crouching by a row of wooden crates, each labeled in chalk in a cramped hand. The attic was dim and close, full of the smell of old linen and dust, and the single window let in a square of evening light that fell across his hands and the side of his face. He was reading a letter. Not working. Not inspecting. Reading, with the particular stillness of someone absorbed in words that had been meant for him. He heard her step and looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I will only be a moment," she said. "Mrs. Dorcas wants the leather trunk." "Third row," he said. "It has a brass clasp." She found it and worked it free from between two others without asking for help, which she could not have explained, except that it seemed important, in that close, quiet space, not to make herself a greater intrusion than she already was. She carried it to the door. "Miss Vane," he said as she reached the landing. She stopped. "The letter in your apron pocket. The corner is torn. If it needs sealing, Mrs. Pollitt keeps wax." He had noticed a torn letter corner in her apron pocket from a distance of 15 feet in a dim attic. She went down the stairs with the trunk in her arms and a feeling pressing steadily at the center of her chest. If you have ever watched someone be seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while, you understand what was happening to Nora Vane without her permission. The world had decided, since her father's death, that she was a problem to be settled. The letter in her pocket was from her father's former employer, who had written out of courtesy to say that there was, regrettably, no position for her there. She carried it because she had not yet decided whether to let the words be real. The torn corner was from her own hands. She had opened it, and then wished she had not. And in the wishing, she had gripped the envelope too hard. He could not have known any of that. He had seen a torn corner and offered wax, and that was all. She told herself it was nothing. At the end of her 3rd week, Lady Sophronia Voss arrived at Ashcroft. Lady Voss was the aunt of the Marquess of Ashcroft, though aunt was perhaps too domestic a word for what she represented. She was a woman of 60, whose authority derived not from any particular office, but from the quality of her certainty, which had been perfected over decades, until it was very nearly indistinguishable from truth. She had the manner of someone who had attended enough events of consequence, that consequence itself had grown to recognize her on sight. She arrived with 2 maids of her own, a small dog, and the understanding, clearly pre-existing, that she was to take the East Wing rooms until the Marquess returned. Mrs. Pollitt received her with the precise warmth of someone who had prepared for this visit and was not surprised by it, but was not quite glad of it either. Nora was assigned to the East Wing for the duration. This placed her in the orbit of Lady Voss's own maid, a narrow woman named Miss Fenwick, who managed her mistress's wardrobe with the concentration of a general managing supply lines, and who regarded every other household servant as a potential disruption to those supply lines. It was Miss Fenwick who delivered the first voicing of the thing that would pursue Nora through the following weeks. On the 2nd morning of Lady Voss's residence, Miss Fenwick passed Nora in the corridor outside the dressing room, and said, without breaking stride, "You needn't bother with any particular attentiveness. Her ladyship won't notice a new maid for at least a fortnight. To her, they are all the same face until proven otherwise." It was said without cruelty, as a simple provision of information. And it was, perhaps, not even about Nora in particular. But Nora felt the shape of it settle over her the way a too large borrowed dress settles, technically covering her, technically fitting, and wrong in every specific. They were all the same face. Interchangeable. Not there. She thought, briefly, of the man in the attic who had seen the torn corner of a letter from 15 feet away. She pressed the thought down and went to work. Lady Voss proved to be a woman of exacting domestic standards and intermittent conversational generosity. She was not cruel. She simply organized the world according to a hierarchy so thoroughly internalized that she could not imagine it had any gaps in it. She noticed Nora on the 5th day of her residence, which was slightly ahead of Miss Fenwick's predicted fortnight, though the notice took the form of a request for more coals to be brought in the morning rather than in the afternoon, and the request was addressed not to Nora directly, but to the air above Nora's left shoulder. It was on the afternoon of that same day that Nora saw the steward stop walking. She was coming down the side stair from the East Wing with an armful of linen when she caught sight of Mr. Carey in the corridor below, reviewing something with a footman named Thomas. They were standing beside the large window at the end of the passage, and Thomas was describing something with his hands, and Carrie was listening in the particular way he listened, very still, his attention complete. Then Lady Voss appeared from the drawing room, and Thomas straightened, and Carrie did not change his posture at all, but something in his face settled like a door that had been pulled very slightly shut. Nora had not been moving quickly, and she was still on the upper step, behind the curve of the banister, and she could not have said afterward why she did not come down. She watched him accept Lady Voss's small, imperious instruction, deliver a brief response, and return his attention to Thomas with the same completeness as before. Not deferential, not defensive, simply present, and then present again in a different direction. She went down the stairs. Thomas caught her eye and gave her a look she could not interpret, and then looked away. It was nothing. It was a steward conducting business with a temporary guest. She had no reason to turn it over in her mind. She turned it over in her mind for the better part of the evening. There are certain economies of attention that betray us before we have named what we are paying attention to. Nora noticed that Mr. Carey took his supper separately from the upper household staff, not in conspicuous isolation, but in a small room off the estate office that functioned as a sort of secondary sitting room for persons of ambiguous rank. She noticed that he never called for anything, that objects simply appeared as needed, that Mrs. Pollitt moved around him with a facility that suggested long practice rather than simple familiarity. She noticed that he walked the grounds before dark each evening, not as a man anxious about his work might, but with the measured attention of someone looking at the land as it needed to be seen. She was not building a case. She was not thinking of him in any way that required examination. She was, she told herself firmly, simply observant. The letter from her father's clockmaker friend arrived on a Wednesday, and it was better than the previous letter had been, which was to say it offered nothing but left room for hope, which is its own quiet cruelty. She read it in the small window embrasure off the main corridor, where the afternoon light came through at a useful angle, and when she was done, she folded it with care and put it away. "I will be in the North Meadow until 4, if Mrs. Pollitt has anything for the tenant reports." It was Mr. Carey, passing the corridor with a pair of riding gloves, already glancing at the papers under his arm. He had not been speaking to her. He had been speaking to Thomas, who was 3 feet behind Nora and whom she had not noticed. "Yes, sir," Thomas said. Carey passed. He did not glance toward the window embrasure. Nora kept her face still and let the moment settle. She was finding, against all prudent counsel from within herself, that she liked him. This was inconvenient. She was a maid. He was the steward. Even within the domestic hierarchy, the distance was considerable, and she had no illusions about her current position or the degree to which the world had recently reminded her of its existence. She was 23, and her father was dead, and she was carrying linen and learning which corridor led to the still room. This was not the moment for any kind of wanting. She folded the feeling away alongside the letter and went back to work. The witnessing happened on a Thursday afternoon. She had been sent to the kitchen garden for a specific herb for Mrs. Pollitt, and she was crossing the walled section nearest the old well when she heard the voices. Not quarreling. Negotiating, in the way that tenants sometimes negotiate with their land. Carefully, with the knowledge that the terms are not equal. She rounded the garden wall and found Mr. Carey standing with a man she did not know, a thick-set man of perhaps 50 in a coat that had been good some years ago. And between them, seated on the bench beside the well, was a boy of about 12 who was staring at his own boots with the focused intensity of someone trying not to cry. Carey was speaking in a voice low enough that she caught only the shape of the exchange, not the words. The man was explaining something, his hands moving in the particular gesture of someone accounting for themselves. Carey listened. He asked one question, He listened to the answer. Then he reached into his coat and took out not money, she saw, but a folded document, which he placed in the man's hands. He said something else. The man looked at the document. He looked at Carrie. He said something very short. Carrie glanced at the boy. He said something, and the boy looked up from his boots, and Carrie said it again. And the boy's face changed in the way a face changes when a very specific and feared thing turns out not to be happening after all. Nora had pressed herself against the garden wall. She had not meant to stay. She had simply not moved in time. Carrie bent slightly to say something else to the boy, and when he straightened, his face was precisely as it always was, set with that habitual preoccupation, and Nora understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that she was watching a man who did this often and privately, and did not think of it as anything but the work. She took her herb and went back to the house by the long way around the garden, so as not to be seen. The shape of what she had observed stayed with her. He had been protecting something. A tenancy, perhaps? A debt? The document had been folded in the manner of an agreement, and the man had held it, as you hold a thing you had not expected to be handed. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that the boy had stopped staring at his boots. She told no one. It was not her knowledge to dispense. Lady Voss's niece arrived on the following Monday. Miss Frederica Voss was 20 and possessed of considerable beauty and the absolute confidence of someone who had been told since childhood that the world had been arranged for her arrival. She wore a walking dress of white sprigged muslin and a Spencer jacket of pale rose that probably cost more than Nora's entire trunk, and she greeted the house with the comfortable expectation that it would arrange itself agreeably. She was not malicious. She was simply in possession of a script that had always worked. The script included, apparently, the attentions of any personable man within a reasonable radius. On her second morning at Ashcroft, she was walking the gardens with Lady Voss when they encountered Mr. Carey inspecting the south wall, and Miss Voss paused and asked a question about the kitchen garden that was not really a question about the kitchen garden. Carey answered it directly, with the same economy he brought to everything, and Miss Voss laughed and said that he was frightfully businesslike, wasn't he? And Carey said, without inflection, that he was, and returned to his inspection. Nora saw none of this. She heard it from Dorcas at supper, in Dorcas's customary style of approximately 6 words and several laden silences. Miss Voss tried for the steward, Dorcas said, serving herself more bread. He answered her like a ledger. Is that usual? Nora asked. Dorcas looked at her. With him? Yes. It was not a reassuring answer, because it suggested either that he was entirely indifferent to the charms of personable young women of rank, or that he was indifferent to everything and everyone with equal consistency, and she could not tell which answer was the more or less complicated one. She took her bread and did not ask anything further. The second voicing came from Lady Voss herself. It was the following Thursday afternoon. Nora had been in the drawing-room laying a fire when Lady Voss came in from the garden with Miss Fenwick, not having seen Nora at first, and Lady Voss was saying, in the carrying way of someone accustomed to rooms with no significant listeners in them, "The new girl is reasonably competent, I will allow, though she has that quality of persons who have fallen in station. One can always tell. They are either too quiet or too eager. And this one is the former." She noticed Nora then, and her expression did not shift, which was in its own way more pointed than if it had. "More coals in the morning," she said, "and do ask someone to see to the east window latch. It does not seat properly." Nora said, "Yes, my lady," and kept her face as smooth as the walls. Too quiet. Fallen in station. One can always tell. She finished laying the fire. She did not allow her hands to shake. It was that same evening that she and Mr. Carey had what she would think of, afterwards, as the real conversation. She had been taking air in the small yard off the north kitchen passage, the one servants used in the evenings when the kitchen was too warm, and he came through the gate from the direction of the stable yard with a paper in his hand that he was reading as he walked. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Vane?" he said. He folded the paper and put it away. "I was taking air," she said. Unnecessary. He could see that. He came and stood at the other end of the bench she was occupying, not near enough to crowd, not so far as to suggest he was avoiding her. He looked out at the narrow strip of garden, which in the late September evening was more gray than green. "You are settling into the house," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. Then, because she was not accustomed to saying less than she thought. "It is a well-ordered house. That is not always the case." He was quiet for a moment. "It was not when I arrived." The previous steward had spent 12 years working under the assumption that an estate manages itself if you do not look at it too hard. She laughed before she could stop herself, a small, dry sound, and she pressed her lips together immediately. He did not smile. Something in his expression shifted, though, in the way a window shifts when a room changes temperature, almost imperceptibly, and only if you were watching. "Do you miss Nottingham?" he said. Not quite a question. She looked at him. He had remembered where she was from. There was no earthly reason a steward would remember where a new maid was from. She had said it once, to Mrs. Pollitt, in her first interview. "The shop," she said after a moment. "My father's workshop. He made clocks." She paused. "I saw your mill model, on the writing desk." He was very still. "I did not touch it," she said. "I was only carrying the ledger. But the joinery at the sluice fitting was very fine." Something had changed in the quality of his attention. She felt it the way you feel a change in the air before rain. Not the thing itself, but the preparation for it. "My father made a similar model once," he said. "For a client in Derby who could not understand the mechanism without seeing it." There it was, she thought. A man who thought in mechanisms, who needed to hold the shape of a thing in his hands before it was real to him. She recognized it completely. They did not speak again for several minutes. The evening settled around them. A single candle burned in the passage window, and its light fell out into the yard in a narrow column, and she was aware of him beside her, the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold for a long time. Not as heat exactly, but as the absence of cold, which is sometimes the same and sometimes different. "I should go in," she said at last. "Yes," he said. She went. She did not sleep particularly well. What she did not know, and would not know for another 10 days, was that in the library of Ashcroft Park, in a locked drawer of the writing desk, there was a letter from the house's solicitors, and that the Marquess had read it and come home. Not in a carriage with footmen and advance notice. He had come on horseback. At night, alone, 3 days before the season's end, let himself in through the north gate with a key he had kept for 7 years, and spent the night in the estate office reviewing the quarter reports. His name was Edmund Farley. He was 35 years old. He had been Marquess of Ashcroft since the age of 28, when his father died and left him a title, 3 estates, and accounts that did not balance. He had learned the estate on his feet, in the fields and the offices and the tenant farms, until the machinery of it became legible to him. At some point in that process, he had stopped thinking of the steward's work as beneath him and started thinking of it as the only honest part of the title. He had not intended to maintain the pretense beyond the first season. Then it had become useful. Then it had become something he could not cleanly surrender. this freedom to know the estate without being known by it. The house knew him as Mr. Carey. The tenants knew him as Mr. Carey. Mrs. Pollitt knew the truth, and had kept it with the precision of someone who understood that some fictions do more good than the truth would. He had not anticipated her, he told himself, when he thought about her in the following days. That what had happened was the natural consequence of proximity. A new maid with no prior knowledge of Ashcroft's particular geography, no investment in its fictions, who had simply looked at the man in front of her and responded to what was there. No deference, no calculation, no reading of his rank through his coat. He had been asked, on her second morning, whether he wanted fresh water brought to the estate office, and she had asked it the way you ask a person, with the assumption that the answer was his to give, not hers to predict. It had been 7 years since anyone had asked him something in quite that way. He had not touched the sluice model since she mentioned it. He could not have said why. The dark moment, when it came from a direction Nora had not been watching. It arrived in the form of Miss Frederica Voss's walking in on a conversation. Nora had been in the estate office passage, delivering a message from Mrs. Pollitt regarding the East Wing linen count, and she had knocked and been admitted by Mr. Carey, who was alone, and she had delivered the message, and he had said, "Tell her Tuesday," and she had turned to go. Miss Voss opened the door from the corridor at that same moment and checked briefly, taking in the scene with the quick, clear comprehension of a young woman who had been trained since the nursery to read rooms. It was nothing. It was a maid delivering a message, as maids did, every hour of every day. There was nothing in the scene that admitted of any other reading. Miss Voss did not say anything. She smiled pleasantly and asked Carey something about the carriage schedule, and he answered, and Nora left. She heard, through the thin door and the thin walls of country houses, Miss Voss say to her aunt that evening, "The quiet maid has taken a great interest in the steward." She heard Lady Voss reply, "Oh, that is always the way with that sort of woman. Nothing else to occupy them. I shall speak to Mrs. Pollitt. That sort of woman. Nothing else to occupy them." Lady Voss did speak to Mrs. Pollitt. Mrs. Pollitt came to find Nora the following morning, and her expression was careful in the particular way of someone navigating between loyalties. "Lady Voss has requested that you be reassigned to the lower floors for the remainder of her residence," she said. "It is not a reflection of your work, Miss Vane. It is a matter of comfort." Nora looked at her. She understood Mrs. Pollitt perfectly. She also understood, with a clarity that had no comfort in it at all, that she had allowed herself to hope for something she had no right to hope for, and that the house had now closed that possibility as surely as a door drawn shut and latched. She said, "Yes, of course," and went. She did not cry. She carried coal on the lower floors and turned mattresses and polished the hall grate and listened to the sounds of the house above her. The third voicing found her in the cold passage off the servants' stair, where Thomas was speaking to another footman, and Nora arrived from around the corner without either of them noticing her, and Thomas was saying, in a lowered voice, "Lady Voss told Mrs. Pollitt the girl was manufacturing excuses to be near the steward. Poor thing, she's new and she doesn't know what she's about." She stood very still. Poor thing. She doesn't know what she's about. She turned quietly and went back the way she had come. It was the following morning that everything changed, and it changed in the dining room, in front of Lady Voss and Miss Voss and Mrs. Pollitt and Thomas and the 3 other servants carrying out the breakfast. Nora was not supposed to be there. She had been sent, incorrectly, by Dorcas, who had misread the morning schedule. She arrived at the dining room doorway with a piece of equipment nobody needed, and Lady Voss was there, and Miss Voss was there, and Mr. Carey was there. standing at the sideboard reviewing the estate schedule that Mrs. Pollitt had laid out. And Lady Voss said, without lowering her voice, "Miss Fenwick, what is that girl doing in here?" She was reassigned to the lower floors. The room held very still. Miss Fenwick, who was pouring Lady Voss's tea, did not look up. "I could not say, my lady." "She is clearly still seeking situations above her station," Lady Voss said. "It is tiresome. One expects it of a woman with no occupation and no prospects, but it does become tedious." Nora heard her own blood in her ears. She stood in the doorway, and she did not move, because to move was to do one of two things: to retreat and confirm the verdict, or to advance and make herself the spectacle Lady Voss had already named her. She thought of her father, who had always said that the moment you let someone define your frame, the argument was already lost. She thought of the boy beside the well, staring at his boots, waiting to find out what was going to happen to him. She thought of the torn letter corner. "Wax for ceiling, Miss Vane." She stood straight, and she said in a voice that was level, "I was sent by Dorcas. I will return to her and clarify the instructions." She did not apologize. She did not explain. She kept her eyes forward and her back straight, and she turned toward the door. "Mr. Carey," Lady Voss said then, with the satisfied air of someone who has just established a point, "do see that the domestic arrangements on the lower floors are better managed. I cannot account for this sort of confusion in a well-ordered house." There was a pause. It was not a long pause. It was perhaps 3 seconds, which in the particular temperature of that room was a very considerable interval indeed. "Lady Voss," said the voice she knew as Mr. Carey's, level and without inflection, "I must ask your indulgence for a moment." He set down the estate schedule. He turned from the sideboard. He did not cross the room quickly. He crossed it with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has decided that speed would diminish the weight of his arrival. He stopped between Nora and the door. "Miss Vane's presence here this morning is my fault," he said. "I asked Mrs. Pollitt to send her. The schedule had not been updated." Nora looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Lady Voss with a composure so complete it was almost a form of generosity. He was giving her the face of a man she had always believed herself to be addressing, a steward managing a small administrative error, a man of competent and unremarkable function. Lady Voss frowned. "Then the schedule should be kept more accurately, Mr. Carey." "Quite," he said. "I will ensure it." He turned then. He looked at Nora. She saw it in that second, the thing she had been assembling in the dark for weeks. The way he held himself, the particular quality of his attention, the mill model, the document given to the man beside the well. 7 years of this, 7 years of knowing a house by being inside it rather than above it, and the way that choice had made him, and the way he was looking at her now, without the careful neutrality of a steward, with something else entirely, something that did not have a place in the hierarchy of this house and had existed anyway, for weeks, between the two of them. She did not speak. There was no speech for this. He said quietly enough that only she heard, "My name is Edmund." The room had already moved on. Lady Voss was accepting her tea with the air of someone whose morning had been marginally disrupted. Miss Voss was looking out the window at the garden. Thomas was carrying a dish to the sideboard. Nora looked at the man standing in front of her, who was not a steward, who had just protected her without announcing what he was, who had chosen his moment with the same precision he brought to mill mechanisms and tenant accounts and kitchen garden drainage. And she understood that the minimum sufficient action had been performed. A correction? A claim of responsibility? a name offered in the threshold of a room where no one else could hear it. She said very quietly, "I know." She did not mean the name. She meant all of it. He stepped back. She went through the door. She did not see him again that morning. She did not expect to. What happened in the following hours was largely invisible to Nora, occurring in the estate office and the library, and in 2 conversations Mrs. Pollitt had with Lady Voss that Nora was not party to. She carried coal and folded linen and waited with the patience of someone who had learned, by necessity, how to hold still while the world rearranged itself around her. In the late afternoon, Mrs. Pollitt found her. "You are to come to the library," she said. Her expression was carrying something that might, if you pressed it very hard, have yielded to a smile. The library was the room Nora had seen only through description. It was everything the rest of the house promised. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fire laid with the specific attentiveness of a room in daily use, a window at the south end with the last of the October light coming through at a low angle and lying across the turkey carpet in a wide, soft band. He was standing by the window. He had changed coats. He was wearing something very different from the plain working coat she had known him in. A dark navy tailcoat, fitted with a high collar and a white cravat, and the whole imposing apparatus of what he actually was. He looked, in short, like the man Lady Voss had been addressing without knowing it for the past 3 weeks. He looked, also, like himself. The jaw, the brow, the quality of attention that had been directed at drainage reports and mill models and the torn corner of a letter from a creditor, now directed at her. Nora stood in the center of the room and did not pretend to be unaffected, because that would have been a form of dishonesty, and she had nothing left to spend on dishonesty. "You have managed your own house for 7 years, she said, without telling it what it was managing. "Yes," he said. "And Mrs. Pollitt knew. She has always known. And you wrote your own reports." "In a very small hand," he said, which Mrs. Pollitt required a candle and patience to read. There it was, the almost not a smile, the one she had catalogued weeks ago as a significant event. It was, she found, more significant than she had catalogued. She said, "Why are you telling me now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you treated me as a man when you did not know what I was, and I would rather have that than anything your knowledge of the title could produce." She looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. The October light shifted, softening. She said, "That is a good reason." He crossed the room. He did not hurry. When he reached her, he stopped, close enough that she could see the slight roughness of his jaw that a morning's work had produced, the faint evidence of soil still at the edge of one cuff that he had not quite managed to remove, and she thought of the kitchen garden and the man on his knees in the dirt, the first morning she had arrived. She had seen him then. She had not known what she was seeing. He reached out and took her hand. Her glove was off. She had been working, and his fingers closed around hers with the deliberateness of a man committing to a mechanism rather than testing it. "Nora," he said. "Not Miss Vane. Not in front of the household. Quietly, in the library, with no one to hear but the fire and the books, and whatever it was that had been building between them in the space of 3 weeks and a dozen conversations that were not supposed to matter." She said, "Edmund." It was the first time she had said it aloud. It landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there, warm and exact, like a key turned precisely in its lock. Lady Voss departed Ashcroft Park on the following Monday morning, 2 days earlier than planned, with the dignified air of someone who had decided to be required elsewhere. Miss Voss departed with her. Miss Fenwick departed with them both. The carriages were brought round at 9:30, and the house emerged from their presence slowly, the way a room emerges from the opening of windows, not dramatically, but with a gradual return to its own particular quality of air. Nora watched from an upper window and felt something she had not felt in 7 months, since the morning of her father's fever. She felt located, not rescued. She was clear on this, in the particular way of someone who has examined the distinction with care. She had not been rescued. She had been seen, which is a different, and in some ways more difficult thing, because rescue requires only the action of one person, and seeing requires the truth of 2. She had told him, in the library, about her father. Not everything. Some of it. The workshop and the clocks and the way her father had thought in mechanisms, the way she had learned to look at the shape of a thing before its surface. He had listened in the way he always listened, with the complete attention that had first disordered her in an anteroom off the estate office. And when she finished, he had said, "He sounds like a man worth understanding." She had pressed her lips together at that. She had not trusted herself to answer. She answered now, in the privacy of her own thoughts, watching the Voss carriages take the South Drive and diminish toward the road. Yes, she thought. He was. The engagement was announced not publicly, but procedurally, in the manner of the period. A letter from Edmund's solicitor to the Register, a note to Mrs. Pollitt, and a conversation with the senior tenant farmers, who received the news with the careful equanimity of people accustomed to surprises from the main house, and who then dispersed to their cottages to be surprised in private. The news reached the servants' hall by the route such news always travels, not in a single announcement, but in a series of small, verified confirmations, each one slightly more specific than the last, until the fact was simply present in the room the way a fire is present, as something everyone has oriented toward without exactly deciding to. Dorcas said nothing. She sat at the head of the servants' supper table and served herself bread in silence, and then she looked at Nora and gave a single nod that carried everything she had not said in 4 weeks, which was considerable. Thomas said, "Well?" which was also considerable, from Thomas. Mrs. Pollitt said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing of all, because Mrs. Pollitt's silences were the kind that had already said everything they needed to. On a morning in November, when the first frost had come in the night and lay thin and white across the kitchen garden and the gravel walks and the south face of the stone wall, Nora went out early, before the house was properly moving. Wrapped in the thick wool mantle Mrs. Pollitt had pressed on her without explanation, 3 days after the engagement was known. She went to the kitchen garden. He was there. Of course he was. It was barely 7 in the morning, and he was examining the drainage at the base of the south wall with the same concentration he had been examining it the morning she arrived, and his coat was the plain working coat, not the navy tailcoat, because the Gardens did not care about tailcoats. He heard her step and looked up. She stopped at the gate. The frost was bright on the grass between them, undisturbed in the early light. "The sluice model," she said. "On the writing desk. I never asked what it was for." He looked at her for a moment. "The mill on the north boundary. The leat has been inadequate for 15 years. I have been working out a solution." "Have you worked it out?" "Very nearly." She came through the gate and across the frosted grass to where he was standing, and she crouched beside him to look at the drainage problem in the wall. And he showed her the difficulty with a brief gesture and a patience that was not condescension, but genuine confidence that she would understand. And she did understand, and she said so. He sat back on his heels. She stayed beside him, close enough that their coats touched, and the frost around them caught the early light and held it, small and bright, across the whole surface of the garden. He reached, without looking at her, and took her hand again, the way he had in the library. with that same exactness. His glove was still on. Hers was not, because she had pulled it off to feel the cold stone of the wall. His fingers closed around her bare hand carefully, as though he understood what it cost a person to hold a cold thing and not flinch. She looked at the frost. She looked at the garden wall. She looked at his profile, which was still the profile she had noticed the first morning, jaw set with preoccupation, brow furrowed at something in the earth. There was nothing to say that was not contained already in the fact of their two hands held in a frosted garden at 7 in the morning. She thought of her father's workshop, the smell of machine oil and sawdust, and the small, persistent music of a clock being properly set. She thought of the model on the writing desk and the document given to a man beside a well and the torn corner of a letter sealed, eventually, with wax. She thought. Here. The garden held them both in the early light, and the frost did not melt, and the house at their backs stood as it had stood for 100 years, patient and ordinary and full of rooms that would keep their warmth. If this story moved you in any way you have not yet found words for, consider sitting with it a moment longer. She asked for nothing. She gave nothing up. She was simply herself, and that turned out to be enough. The frost caught the light a little while longer. Then the house woke. The day began. She was still there. She was